They say that the past is a foreign country, but for those of us who have been truly broken, the past is more like a prison cell. You can walk out of the doors, you can change your name, you can move 1,000 miles away, but you always carry the keys in your pocket. You always hear the rattle of the locks when the room gets too quiet. My name is a secret I kept from myself for a long time, but my story is one that lives in the shadows of every person who has ever been told they weren't enough. Today, I am going to take you back. I am going to take you to the moment where the world stopped spinning, and the woman who stole my breath, my home, and my future was finally brought to her knees. But before I open that door, before we walk down the sterile, echoing hallways of the hospital where it all ended, I need to look you in the eye. I need to ask you something that most people are too afraid to answer. Think about the person who destroyed you. I'm not talking about a small slight or a playground bully. I am talking about the person who sat at your table, drank your tea, and then systematically dismantled your life with the precision of a surgeon. The person who took your reputation and turned it into ash. The person who looked at your pain and called it a performance. Now imagine it is 3 o'clock in the morning. Your life is peaceful now. You've healed. You've moved on. And suddenly your phone rings. It's the hospital. That person, that monster from your nightmares, is dying. They are alone. Their family has abandoned them. Their friends have vanished. And because of a clerical error, or perhaps a cruel joke by fate, you are the only person listed as their emergency contact. The doctor is on the line. They need a decision. They need someone to hold a hand that once struck them. They need someone to sit in the silence of a dying room so a soul doesn't have to cross over alone. What do you do? Do you hang up the phone and go back to sleep, satisfied that the universe has finally balanced the scales? Or do you get out of bed, put on your shoes, and drive into the heart of the storm? Pause. I want you to be honest. This isn't a place for the right answer. This is a place for the truth. Go to the comments right now. Do not wait. Type, "I would stay," or "I would walk away." I want to see your names. I want to know where you are listening from. Nigeria, London, the United States, South Africa. Wherever you are, tell me your city and tell me your choice. Because the choice I made, it didn't just change her life, it changed the very fabric of my soul. We are about to embark on a journey through 12 chapters of betrayal, memory, and the ultimate test of human restraint. This is not just a story about revenge. This is a story about what happens when the victim becomes the judge. Take a deep breath. Clear your mind. The phone is ringing. The darkness is waiting. Let's begin.
The darkness of my apartment had always been a shield. For 10 years, I had carefully curated a life of quiet anonymity. No drama, no high stakes, just the steady rhythm of a woman who had survived a shipwreck and finally found dry land. But at 3:14 a.m., the shield shattered. The sound was a low, aggressive vibration, a phone dancing against the wood of my nightstand. In the dead of night, that sound doesn't just wake you, it invades you. I lay there for a long time, my heart hammering against my ribs, watching the blue light of the screen pulse against the ceiling like a dying star. I knew that rhythm. I knew that a call at this hour was never a blessing. It was a summons from a world I thought I had escaped. When I finally reached out, my fingers were cold, trembling with a primal sort of dread. I didn't recognize the number. "Hello?" I whispered. The word felt like it was made of sand. "This is the night nursing supervisor at Memorial Hospital," the voice on the other end said. It was a woman's voice, hollow, efficient, and drained of any warmth. "We have an emergency admission, a woman named Margaret Hale. She was brought in an hour ago after a catastrophic stroke. We've attempted to contact her son, Daniel, but he is currently unreachable on an international flight to Singapore. You are still listed in our digital records as her primary healthcare proxy and the only emergency contact on file. We need you here immediately to authorize life-saving measures." The silence that followed was so heavy it felt like the walls were closing in. Margaret. The name alone was a curse I hadn't spoken in a decade. It was the name of the woman who had systematically dismantled my life with the cold precision of a surgeon. She had taken my home. She had poisoned my husband's mind until he looked at me with hatred, and she had stood by with a victorious smile as I was cast out into the cold with nothing but a shattered heart. How was it possible? Margaret was a woman who controlled every shadow, every penny, every person in her orbit. She had lawyers to manage her lawyers. She had spent a fortune making sure I was erased from her family's legacy. And yet here, in the final desperate hour of her life, when the machines were beeping and the darkness was closing in, the only name left in the folder was mine. I sat on the edge of my bed, the floorboards freezing against my bare feet. I remembered the night she had me escorted out of the estate. I remembered the rain that night, how it soaked through my thin coat as I stood at the gates, watching the life I had built disappear in the rearview mirror of a taxi. I remembered the things she said to me, that I was a temporary lapse in judgment, that I was beneath the dignity of the Hale name. My blood turned to ice. A part of me, the part that still carried the scars of her cruelty, wanted to hang up. I wanted to lie back down, pull the covers over my head, and let the hospital staff deal with her. Let her die in the same cold silence she forced upon me. She deserved the loneliness. She deserved the void. But as I sat there, breathing in the stale air of my bedroom, a different feeling began to take hold. It wasn't forgiveness. God, no. It wasn't that. It was a heavy, suffocating sense of duty, not to her, but to the person I had become despite her. I couldn't be the monster she tried to make me. I found myself dressing in slow, deliberate movements. I pulled on a dark sweater, found my keys, and walked out into the night like a ghost returning to the scene of its own murder. The drive to the hospital was a surreal journey. The city looked like a graveyard of concrete and glass, the orange streetlights flickering overhead in a rhythmic, hypnotic pulse. Every mile was a memory. I thought about the night she had me escorted out of the estate. I remembered the
I stepped into the room, and the door clicked shut behind me with a sound that felt as final as a prison bolt. For a moment, I didn't move. I stood in the shadows of the entryway, my back against the cold wood, waiting for my eyes to adjust to the gloom. The only light came from the row of monitors above the bed, a series of jagged green and blue lines that pulsed with a rhythmic, mechanical beep. Beep, beep, beep. It was the sound of a life being counted out in electronic increments. The smell of the room was overwhelming. It wasn't just the sharp, stinging scent of isopropyl alcohol and industrial-grade disinfectant. It was the smell of stasis. It was the scent of a body that was no longer fighting for itself, but being kept alive by the sheer force of modern science. I forced my feet to move. Each step toward the bed felt like walking through deep water. My shoes made a soft, sticky sound against the linoleum, a sound that seemed loud enough to wake the dead. And then I was standing right beside her. I had spent 10 years imagining this woman as a giant. In my nightmares, Margaret Hale was 10 feet tall, with a voice like a whip and eyes that could freeze the blood in your veins. I remembered her standing in the grand foyer of her estate, draped in silk and smelling of expensive French perfume, pointing a manicured finger toward the door and telling me to never look back. I remembered the power she radiated, the kind of power that comes from never being told no. But the woman in the bed, she was a stranger. She looked like a hollowed-out shell. Her skin, which she used to keep taut and youthful by the best surgeons money could buy, now hung loose and gray against her skull. Her hair, which she used to wear in a perfect silver-blonde coiffure, was thin and matted, splayed across the pillow like dead grass. Her mouth was partially open, a plastic tube snaking down her throat to provide the air her lungs had forgotten how to pull. I pulled a stiff blue plastic chair to the side of the bed. The screech of the metal legs against the linoleum was a jagged, ugly noise. But Margaret didn't flinch. She couldn't. I sat down and leaned forward, my elbows on my knees, my face inches away from hers. I wanted to see if the monster was still in there. "You look different, Margaret," I whispered. My voice sounded strange in the small room, heavy and thick with a decade's worth of unspoken words. I looked at her hands. They were resting on the white thermal blanket, skeletal and translucent. I could see the blue maze of her veins beneath the skin. These were the hands that had signed the checks to pay off the people who lied about me. These were the hands that had held my husband's face while she whispered that I was poisoning the family bloodline. These were the hands that had never once offered me a glass of water when I was pregnant and nauseous, because she didn't want the help to see her being kind to me. The anger hit me in, not a hot, sudden flash, but a cold, rising tide. I felt it in the back of my throat, sharp and metallic. Why was I here? Why was I sitting in this chair, breathing her air, watching her heart beat? I thought about the 3 years I spent married to her son, 3 years of being told I wasn't enough, I wasn't wealthy enough. I wasn't connected enough. I wasn't Hale enough. I remembered the miscarriage. I remembered sitting in a bathroom, crying in a way that felt like my soul was being torn out of my body. And I remembered Margaret standing outside the door, not asking if I was okay, but telling Daniel through the wood that I was milking it for drama. She had convinced him that I wasn't fit to be a mother, and eventually he started to believe her. "Do you know I'm here?" I asked the silent woman. I searched her face for a flicker, a twitch of an eyelid, a shift in her breathing. Nothing. Just the mechanical hiss-click of the ventilator. The irony of the situation began to settle into my bones. Margaret Hale, the woman who valued legacy above all else, was dying in a room where the only person who cared enough to show up was the woman she had tried to erase. Her son was in the air, somewhere over the Pacific, chasing a deal that her mother had trained him to prioritize over everything else. Her friends, those women in pearls who laughed at her jokes, were nowhere to be found. She was alone with her victim. I reached out my hand. My fingers hovered just an inch above hers. I wanted to touch her skin, to see if it felt as cold as it looked, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. The thought of physical contact with her made my skin crawl. I was the emergency contact. I was the one who had to decide whether to sign the "do not resuscitate" papers if her heart stopped. I was the one who had to decide how much pain she should be in. For 10 years, she had held my life in her hands and crushed it. Now I held hers. And as I sat there in the dim, flickering light of the ICU, I realized that I didn't want to kill her. Death would be too easy. It would be too quick. No, I wanted her to wake up. I wanted her to open those cold, gray eyes just once more, so she could see exactly who was standing over her at the end of the world.
The hours in a hospital don't move like regular time. They stretch and bend, distorted by the hum of machinery and the weight of the air. By the time the clock on the wall ticked toward 5 a.m., the world outside was beginning to shift from black to a bruised, heavy purple. I hadn't moved from the plastic chair. My joints were stiff, and my eyes burned from the dry, recycled air of the ICU, but I couldn't look away from the woman in the bed. A soft knock at the door broke the trance. A nurse entered, a woman named Sarah, whose uniform was crisp despite the late hour. She moved with the practiced quiet of someone used to walking among the dying. She checked the monitors, adjusted the flow of the IV, and then turned to look at me. Her expression was one of gentle, misplaced sympathy. "It's a long night, isn't it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hiss of the ventilator. "I saw your name on the chart. It's good she has you here. Most people in this ward end up facing the end with nothing but the machines for company." I felt a bitter laugh bubble up in my chest, but I kept it down. "Has there been any word from her son?" I asked. The name Daniel felt like a stone in my mouth. Sarah sighed, a small, tired sound. The hospital administrator finally got through to his office in Singapore. He spoke with a personal assistant. Apparently, Mr. Hale is in the middle of closing a multi-billion-dollar merger. The assistant said he expressed his deep concern and gave us a credit card to cover any and all expenses. He told us to spare no cost for her comfort. She paused, her eyes searching mine. But when we asked when he would be arriving, the assistant said he wouldn't be able to catch a flight for at least another 10 days.
He said his mother would understand the importance of the work. I stared at her, stunned. She would understand the importance of the work. Of course she would. I leaned back in the chair, the plastic creaking under my weight. Margaret had spent 30 years carving the humanity out of her son to make room for ambition. She had raised a man who didn't see a mother, he saw a legacy. He didn't see a dying woman, he saw an administrative hurdle to be managed from a distance with a black American Express. I looked back at Margaret. "You did your job too well, didn't you?" I whispered once the nurse had slipped back out into the hall. Memory flooded back then, unbidden and sharp. I remembered a Tuesday evening 7 years ago. Daniel and I were sitting in our small breakfast nook. He had been happy then. He had been talking about taking a lower-paying job at a non-profit, something that would let him be home for dinner every night. We were planning a life that wasn't about Hale power. And then the phone had rung. It was Margaret. I could hear her voice through the receiver, even from across the room, sharp, cold, and mocking. "A non-profit, Daniel? How charmingly mediocre. I suppose that's the kind of influence your wife has on you. She wants to keep you small so she doesn't feel so out of place." Within a month, she had arranged a better opportunity for him. She had invited his boss to dinner and whispered that I was distracting Daniel from his true potential. She had planted the idea that my love was a cage while her ambition was a ladder. And Daniel, the man who used to bring me wildflowers, slowly began to look at me not as his partner, but as an anchor dragging him down. She had won that battle. She had successfully turned my husband into a stranger who valued a merger more than his mother's last breath. I looked at the heart monitor. The green line was steady, a jagged mountain range of survival. I wondered if somewhere deep in her subconscious she knew she was alone. I wondered if she could hear the silence where her son's voice should be. For 10 years I had hated her for taking him away from me, but standing there in the cold light of dawn, I realized she had lost him too. She had traded his heart for his resume, and now she was dying with the receipt in her hand. The irony was suffocating. I, the common distraction, was the only one who had shown up. I, the woman she called worthless, was the one holding the power of attorney. I was the one who had to decide if the doctors should keep pumping air into her lungs or let her go. I stood up and walked to the window. The sun was just beginning to break over the horizon, bleeding gold onto the city streets. I felt a strange, cold clarity. I wasn't going to leave, not because I loved her and not because I had forgiven her. I was going to stay because I wanted to be the first thing she saw if she ever woke up. I wanted her to realize that in the end, her money and her legacy had bought her nothing but the presence of the woman she tried to destroy.
Day 1 bled into day 2, and day 2 dissolved into the gray, featureless haze of day 3. When you stay in a hospital for long enough, the outside world ceases to exist. There is no weather, no traffic, no news. There is only the fluorescent hum of the ceiling lights and the agonizingly slow drip of the IV bags. I had become a fixture in that room. The nurses began to recognize me, nodding silently as they came in to change Margaret's linens or check the pressure of her oxygen mask. They brought me lukewarm coffee in styrofoam cups and thin, scratchy blankets, assuming I was a grieving daughter-in-law. I never corrected them. The truth was too heavy to carry in a place like this. And besides, I was still trying to understand the truth myself. I spent hours staring at Margaret's face,
tracing the lines of her age. I found myself looking for the woman who had held a press conference, disguised as a charity luncheon, just to announce that she was deeply concerned about my erratic behavior following the divorce. She hadn't named me directly back then, she was too clever for that. But she had whispered in the right ears. She had made sure the local papers knew that the young woman from nowhere had been the reason for the Hale family's private struggles. I remembered the day I walked into my favorite coffee shop a week after the news broke. The owner, a man who had known my name for years, looked at me with a strange, guarded pity. The whispers followed me like a cold draft. Within a month, I was no longer invited to the community board meetings. Within 3 months, my old friends stopped returning my calls. Margaret hadn't just taken my husband, she had poisoned the very ground I walked on. She had made me a pariah in the town I called home. Now, looking at her, I felt a dangerous urge to simply reach out and switch off the monitor. It was a dark, pulsing thought that lived in the back of my mind. It would be so easy. A single button, a few minutes of silence, and the woman who had spent years making my life a living hell would be gone. The world would say it was a tragedy. No one would ever know. I stood up and paced the small perimeter of the room. 4 steps to the window, 4 steps to the sink, 4 steps back to the chair. I felt like a caged animal. Why was I still here? Why was I sacrificing my sleep and my peace for a woman who wouldn't even have spit on me if I were on fire? I looked at the get well flowers that had begun to arrive. Huge, gaudy arrangements of lilies and roses sent by law firms, country clubs, and old family friends. They sat on the windowsill, their scent cloying and sweet, competing with the smell of the disinfectant. Not one of the cards asked how she was doing. They all said things like, "In our thoughts during this transition," or "honoring the Hale legacy." Even in her dying moments, she was being treated like a business transaction. I picked up one of the cards, a gold-embossed note from a prominent judge she used to play bridge with. I remembered this man. He was the one who had presided over our property division. He looked at me over his spectacles with such disdain, clearly influenced by Margaret's concerns about my character. I tore the card in half and dropped it into the wastebasket. It felt like a small, petty victory, but it was the first thing that made me feel alive in days. I turned back to the bed. Margaret's hand twitched. It was a tiny, microscopic movement, but in the stillness of the room, it felt like an explosion. My heart leapt into my throat. Was she waking up? Was the nightmare finally going to have a voice? I leaned over her, my shadow falling across her pale face. "Margaret?" I whispered. "Margaret, can you hear me?" Her eyes didn't open, but her breathing changed. It became faster, more shallow. For the first time, she looked uncomfortable. She looked like she was struggling. I reached out, my hand hovering over the "call nurse" button, but I hesitated. In that moment of hesitation, I saw her for what she truly was, a woman who had spent her entire life building a fortress of lies, only to find herself trapped inside it when the walls started to crumble. She had destroyed me to protect her world, but her world wasn't here to save her. I was. I didn't press the button. Not yet. I sat back down and watched her struggle for a moment longer. I wanted her to feel the weight of the silence. I wanted her to know that the only person left to witness her struggle was the only person she had deemed unworthy. "I'm still here, Margaret," I said, my voice cold and steady. Night 4 arrived with a thunderstorm that rattled the hospital's heavy glass panes. The lightning flashes turned the room into a strobe light, white, then black, then white again, making the machines look like jagged monsters standing guard over the dying woman. I sat in my usual spot, the rhythmic hiss-click of the ventilator now harmonizing with the thunder. I looked at Margaret's closed eyelids and wondered what she was seeing in the dark. Was she remembering the day she finally broke us? It wasn't a single event. It was a slow, agonizing erosion. I remembered the month Daniel was up for the vice presidency at his firm. Margaret had stepped up her concerns. She started small. I'd find things moved in our house, my car keys in the freezer, my birth control pills missing from the cabinet, a burner on the stove left glowing red in the middle of the night. When I told Daniel, he looked at me with a mixture of confusion and pity. "Maybe you're just stressed, honey," he'd say. "Mom says you've been acting a bit forgetful lately." I didn't know then that Margaret had a key. I didn't know she was coming into our home while I was at work, playing a silent psychological game of chess with my sanity. She wanted Daniel to believe I was fragile. She wanted him to see me as a liability to the Hale image. One evening, I came home to find her sitting in our living room, sipping tea with Daniel. The atmosphere was thick, like the air before a storm. Daniel wouldn't look at me. "I was just telling Daniel," Margaret said, her voice smooth as cream, "that I'm worried about your health. I spoke to the family doctor, and he thinks a quiet facility, just for a few weeks, might help you get your head straight. You've been so volatile." "I haven't been volatile," I had screamed, and that was my mistake. In that moment, with my face flushed and my voice cracking, I looked exactly like the unstable woman she had spent months describing to him. I saw the shift in Daniel's eyes. The love didn't vanish. It was replaced by a cold, distant fear. He didn't see his wife anymore. He saw a problem that needed to be managed. That was the night I realized that Margaret Hale didn't just want me gone. She wanted me destroyed. She wanted to ensure that even after I was out of Daniel's life, he would never come looking for me. She wanted him to remember me as a broken thing, a mistake that his mother had graciously helped him fix. I looked at her now, lying there, and the memory of that gaslighting felt like a physical heat in my chest. I remembered the night I lost the baby. I was alone in the house. Daniel was at a late meeting that Margaret had insisted he attend. When the pain started, I called him, but Margaret answered his phone. "She's in a presentation, dear," she said, her voice dripping with fake empathy. "Don't be dramatic. Every woman has cramps. Take an aspirin and go to sleep." By the time Daniel got home 4 hours later, it was too late. And even then, as I lay in the hospital bed, empty and shattered, Margaret whispered to the nurses that I probably caused it myself because I wasn't mentally prepared for motherhood. She turned my greatest tragedy into a weapon against my character. I leaned closer to her now, my face just inches from hers as a fresh bolt of lightning illuminated the room. You thought you were so clever. You thought you broke me into enough pieces I'd never be able to stand up again. You thought Daniel would stay under your thumb forever. The heart monitor let out a sharp, erratic series of beeps. Her chest hitched. For the first time, her eyes flickered beneath the thin skin of their lids. She was in there. Somewhere behind the stroke and the silence, Margaret Hale was listening. I felt a dark sense of satisfaction. I wanted her to remember. I wanted her to feel the phantom pains of every lie she ever told. I wanted her to know that the unstable girl was the only thing holding the line between her and the cold, dark end. I leaned closer to her now, my face just inches from hers as a fresh bolt of lightning illuminated the room. Daniel isn't coming, Margaret, my voice dropping to a low, lethal hum. He's doing exactly what you taught him to do. He's prioritizing the firm. He's prioritizing the legacy. He's being the man you made him. And that man, he doesn't have time for a dying woman. The monitor stabilized, but the air in the room had changed. The power dynamic had shifted. She was no longer the queen, and I was no longer the victim. We were just two women in a room, waiting for the clock to run out.
They say that when you lose everything, you find out who you really are. But they don't tell you that the process of finding out is like being skinned alive. As I sat by Margaret's bed on the 5th night, the hospital grew quiet in a way that felt heavy, almost holy. The hallway lights were dimmed, and the constant scurrying of the day staff had faded into the occasional rhythmic squeak of a night nurse's rubber-soled shoes. In that silence, my mind drifted back to the winter after the divorce, the winter Margaret had planned with the precision of a military campaign. I remembered the day the locks were changed. I had gone to the grocery store, one of the few things I was still allowed to do with the dwindling allowance Margaret permitted Daniel to give me. When I returned, my key wouldn't turn. I stood on the porch of the home I had decorated, the home where I had painted the nursery walls a soft, hopeful blue, and I realized I was being locked out of my own life. Margaret had been standing behind the frosted glass of the front door. I couldn't see her face, but I knew she was there. I could feel her satisfaction vibrating through the wood. Within an hour, a moving truck arrived, not to help me move in, but to drop 2 cardboard boxes on the driveway. 2 boxes. That was what she decided my 3 years of marriage were worth. My clothes, a few books, and a single photo album with the pictures of Daniel and me cut out. I remembered the cold. That winter was the harshest on record. Because Margaret had notified the local rental agencies about my unstable financial and mental status, no one would lease to me. I spent 3 weeks sleeping in my old sedan, parked in the back of a 24-hour pharmacy lot. I would keep the engine running for 10 minutes every hour just to stop my fingers from turning blue. Every morning I would see the local social column in the discarded newspapers. "The Hales host annual winter gala," the headlines would scream. I'd see pictures of Margaret draped in chinchilla fur, smiling as if she hadn't just made a human being homeless. And there was Daniel. He looked thinner, his eyes darker, but he was always at her side. She had reclaimed her prize. She had polished him up and put him back on the shelf, untainted by the common girl he had mistakenly married. I looked at Margaret now. Her chest was laboring under the weight of the ventilator. "I survived that winter," I whispered to her. My voice was a low, jagged rasp. "I worked 3 jobs. I scrubbed floors in buildings you probably own. I ate canned soup in the dark so I could save enough for a security deposit on a basement apartment that smelled like mold." I wanted her to know that the poverty she pushed me into didn't break me. It forged me. It turned the soft, naive girl who believed in kindness as a shield into a woman made of iron and spite. I learned that kindness isn't a shield at all. It's a luxury, and it was a luxury I couldn't afford for a very long time. I remembered the one time I tried to call Daniel. I just wanted to hear his voice. I wanted to ask him if he knew I was living in a basement. Margaret answered. She didn't even give him the phone. She simply said, "He's moved on, dear. He's with someone of his own kind now. If you call again, I'll have the restraining order finalized. Do yourself a favor and vanish." And so I vanished. I changed my name back. I moved 3 towns over. I worked until my hands bled and my back ached, and I built a life that had no room for Hales or pearls or legacy. I leaned over the bed, my shadow stretching long and dark across her frail form. "You thought you killed me that winter, didn't you, Margaret? You told everyone I had suffered a breakdown and moved away to a facility. You turned me into a ghost so you wouldn't have to look at the blood on your hands." The heart monitor suddenly spiked. A sharp, high-pitched ping, ping, ping echoed through the room. Margaret's hand, the one hooked to the pulse oximeter, began to tremble. Her eyes stayed closed, but a single, solitary tear escaped the corner of her left eye and rolled down into the crevice of her ear. I froze. My breath hitched in my throat. Was it a physical reflex, or was she finally, truly feeling the weight of what she had done? I didn't call the nurse. I didn't reach for the tissue to wipe the tear away. I sat back in my blue plastic chair and watched it fall. I had cried enough tears for both of us in that basement apartment. It was time for her to start her own collection.
Night 6. The hospital had a way of stripping away your sense of belonging to the outside world. I looked at my reflection in the dark window glass and barely recognized the woman staring back. My hair was pulled into a messy knot, and there were dark circles under my eyes that looked like bruises. I looked like I had been in a war, and in a way I had. I turned back to the bed. "You know, Margaret," I said, my voice echoing in the small space. "The hardest part wasn't the hunger. It wasn't even the cold. It was the silence. After you've been told for years that you are nothing, you start to believe the silence is your natural state. I spent 5 years in that silence. I rebuilt my life brick by brick, working as a junior accountant, then a manager, then finally starting my own small firm. I did it all without a single Hale connection. I did it because I had to prove to the ghost of you that I existed. But while I was climbing out of the pit you dug for me, I started hearing whispers about the house on the hill. The untouchable Margaret Hale was starting to slip. It started with the staff. You couldn't keep a maid for more than a month. Then the gardeners left. Then the friends stopped showing up for tea. I heard that Daniel's marriage to the suitable woman you picked out for him lasted less than a year. She didn't have my patience, did she? She didn't view your cruelty as a challenge to be overcome. She viewed it as a reason to sue for half of the estate and run for the hills. I watched from a distance as the Hale name started to lose its shine. The scandals, the lawsuits, the whispers of financial mismanagement. You were so busy trying to keep me out of the family that you didn't notice the family was rotting from the inside out. You were the captain of a sinking ship, Margaret, and you were too proud to scream for help. And then came the stroke. The great Margaret Hale found on the floor of her cavernous library by a temp agency cleaner because she had no one left to check on her. The woman who valued appearances above all else was found in a way that was utterly, devastatingly undignified. When the hospital called me, I spent an hour just staring at the wall. I wondered if God had a sense of humor. Out of all the people in your life, the senators, the judges, the socialites, the only name they could find in your in case of emergency file was the girl you threw out like trash 10 years ago. Did you forget to change it? Or in some dark, twisted corner of your heart, did you know that I was the only one who actually knew you? The nurses think I'm a saint. They see me sitting here day after day, and they think it's out of love. They don't realize that I'm not here to comfort you. I'm here to be a witness. I'm here to make sure you don't slip away into the night thinking you got away with it. I leaned over the bed, my hand finally touching the cold metallic rail. You're awake in there, aren't you? You can hear me. You can feel the weight of every day you took from me. Margaret's breathing hitched. A low, guttural rattle started in her chest, the sound of someone trying to scream but having no voice to carry it. The monitors began to chirp, a frantic yellow warning flashing on the screen. I didn't call for help. I just stood there looking down at her, watching the panic move behind her shut eyes. I wanted her to feel what I felt that winter in my car, the sheer paralyzing terror of being alone and helpless. "Don't worry, Margaret," I whispered, my hand as cold as the IV fluids dripping into her arm. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to stay right here until the very end. I'm going to make sure you have everything you need and absolutely nothing that you want." The warning on the monitor faded back to green. The rattle subsided. I sat back down in my plastic chair and picked up a book, but I didn't read. I just watched the jagged line of her heartbeat, counting the seconds of a life that was finally, truly at my mercy.
Day 7. They call it the crisis point in this wing of the hospital. It's the day when the body either decides to claw its way back to the light or surrender to the gravity of the earth. The air in the room felt stagnant despite the humming filtration system. I had begun to lose track of the hours, my internal clock replaced by the 3-hour rotation of the nursing staff. I stood over the small sink in the corner, splashing cold water on my face. The mirror was unkind. I looked like a woman who had spent a week in the trenches. But as I patted my skin dry with a paper towel, I looked over at Margaret, and for the first time I felt a strange, twisted sense of duty. I approached the bed with a basin of warm water and a soft washcloth. The nurses had offered to do it, but I had refused. I wanted to be the one to do this. I dipped the cloth into the water and began to wipe the sweat from her forehead. Her skin felt like damp silk, cold, fragile, and utterly human. "You always hated being touched by the help, didn't you, Margaret?" I said, my voice barely a whisper against the hum of the machines. "You used to wear gloves when you handed me my paycheck, as if my poverty was something you could catch like a cold. And now, look at us." I moved the cloth down her cheek, being careful not to dislodge the tape holding her feeding tube in place. There is a strange intimacy in caring for someone who tried to destroy you. You see the parts of them they spent a lifetime hiding. You see the age spots, the scars from surgeries meant to keep her looking young, the way her jaw sags without the tension of her pride. I wonder if you can feel the warmth of this water. I wonder if it feels like a mercy or a mockery, because I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for the girl I was before I met you. I'm doing it to prove that you didn't manage to kill the part of me that knows how to care. As I cleaned her hands, those hands that had once pointed the way to my exile, I noticed how empty they looked without her rings. The hospital had placed her jewelry in a plastic bag in the safe. Without the 5-carat diamond and the gold bands, she looked remarkably ordinary. She looked like anyone's grandmother. She looked like someone who could be loved. But she wasn't. I thought about my own mother. She had died while I was still married to Daniel. I remembered how Margaret had forbidden me from taking more than 2 days off the funeral. She had told me that grief is a private matter and that I shouldn't burden the household with my gloom. I sat at her dinner table 48 hours after burying my mother, forced to listen to her talk about the quality of the caviar while I choked on my own tears. I squeezed the washcloth a little harder as I wiped Margaret's arm. "You took my chance to mourn in peace," I said, my voice trembling with a decade of suppressed rage. "You took my home. You took my dignity. You even took my husband's memory of who I was. And yet, here I am.
I'm the one cleaning your skin. I'm the one making sure the sores don't develop on your back. I'm the one whispering to you in the dark so the silence doesn't swallow you whole. Suddenly, the monitors began to pulse with a new rhythm. Margaret's heart rate climbed. Her chest, which had been moving in a mechanical, shallow rise and fall, suddenly heaved. A low, wet sound came from the back of her throat. She was trying to speak. I dropped the washcloth into the basin and leaned in, my ear inches from her mouth. "What is it, Margaret? Do you want to tell me you're sorry? Do you want to ask for a priest? Or are you just trying to find a way to insult me one last time?" Her eyes didn't open, but her hand, the one I just cleaned, clutched at the hospital sheet. Her knuckles turned a ghostly white. A single word, distorted by the tube and the stroke, escaped her lips. "Why?" I pulled back, my heart thudding against my ribs. Why? Why was I here? Why was I helping her? Why did I pick up the phone? "Because, Margaret," I said, looking her directly in her closed eyes, "at the end of the day, you are a Hale. You live for power, for legacy, and for the win. But I am a human being, and that is something you will never, ever understand." I picked up the washcloth again and finished my work in silence. The why hung in the air like a ghost, unanswered and unanswerable. But as I tucked the blanket around her frail shoulders, I realized that for the first time in 10 years, the answer didn't matter. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the one who remained. Day 8 arrived with a stillness that was more unsettling than the storm. The hospital air felt thin, recycled, and heavy with the scent of unsaid things. I stood by the window, watching the morning shift change in the parking lot below. People were going to work, grabbing coffee, living lives that didn't involve the rhythmic hiss-click of a life support machine. I turned back to the bed. It was time for the morning routine. The nurses had grown so used to my presence that they now left the basic care to me. They saw it as a devoted family member's love. I saw it as a slow, deliberate ritual of reclamation. I began to bathe her, this woman who once wouldn't let me sit on her silk sofas if I was wearing denim, was now completely exposed to me. I moved the sponge over her thin, translucent skin. It felt like wet parchment. I noticed the small things now, the way her breath rattled in her chest, the way her fingers curled inward like a dying bird's talons. "You're so small now, Margaret," I whispered, the steam from the basin rising between us. "It's hard to remember how much space you used to take up. You used to make me feel like I was shrinking every time you looked at me." I remembered a specific gala, the one where she had introduced Daniel's ex-girlfriend to everyone as the one who got away, right in front of me. I had spent that entire night trying to disappear into the wallpaper, my face burning with a shame that wasn't mine to carry. Margaret had spent the evening gliding through the crowd, a glass of vintage champagne in her hand, making sure every guest knew I was an outsider. Now I was the only one inside. I moved the sponge to her arm, being careful of the bruised skin around her IV site. The doctors say your brain is trying to rewire itself. They say you might be able to hear me. If you can, I want you to know something. I saw the mail that arrived at your house yesterday. The bank sent a notice. The estate is being audited. It seems your meticulous lawyers weren't as loyal as you thought they were. I felt a strange, cold pity as I realized that Margaret's entire empire was built on a foundation of fear, not loyalty. And fear disappears the moment the person in power can no longer strike back. The moment she fell, the vultures began to circle. Her friends were already dividing up her social standing, and her business associates were already looking for ways to distance themselves from her failing accounts. I lifted her head gently to change the pillowcase. For a second, her eyes flickered. It wasn't just a reflex this time. Her pupils moved, searching the room, before landing, heavy and unfocused, directly on my face. The fear in those eyes was absolute. She didn't see a nurse. She didn't see a daughter-in-law. She saw the ghost of the woman she had tried to bury. She saw the girl she had mocked, the wife she had erased, the mother she had prevented me from becoming. "I'm still here, Margaret," I said, my voice as steady as the machines keeping her heart beating. "I'm the one who washes you. I'm the one who decides if you're comfortable. I'm the one who stays when the lights go out." She tried to pull her hand away, a weak, trembling movement that barely ruffled the sheets. It was the most pathetic thing I had ever seen. This woman, who once commanded boardrooms, was now terrified of a washcloth in the hands of a woman she called worthless. I realized then that Margaret Hale's greatest nightmare wasn't death. It was being seen as she truly was, weak, lonely, and dependent on the mercy of a person she had wronged. I didn't feel the triumph I expected. Instead, I felt a deep, exhausting sadness, not for her, but for the version of me that used to want her approval. That girl was long gone, and the woman who replaced her was too tired for hate. "Don't be afraid," I whispered, though I didn't know if I meant it. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm just going to stay. I'm going to make sure you see me every time you open your eyes. I'm going to be your last memory of this world." I tucked the blankets tightly around her, smoothing the fabric until there wasn't a single wrinkle. I made her perfect, just like she always demanded. Then I sat back down in my chair and watched her eyes close again, the weight of the silence returning to fill the room. By the 9th night, the hospital had become my entire universe. I no longer remembered what it felt like to breathe air that didn't smell of ozone and antiseptic. My reflection in the stainless steel of the IV pole was gaunt, my eyes shadowed by a fatigue that went deeper than bone. But as the clock on the wall ticked toward the hollow hour of 4 a.m., I realized that I wasn't just watching Margaret die. I was watching the old version of myself finally burn away. The night nurse had come and gone, leaving me alone with the machine breath of the woman who had spent years trying to suffocate my soul. I stood up to stretch my aching back, my joints popping in the silence. I walked over to the bedside and looked down at her. The monitor showed her heart was struggling. The jagged green line was becoming erratic, a mountain range collapsing in real time. This was the moment I had spent a decade fantasizing about. I had imagined standing over her, laughing as her breath failed. I had imagined leaning in and whispering every cruel thing she had ever said to me back into her ear as she crossed over. My hand hovered over the plastic tubing that fed oxygen into her lungs. It would be so simple, a single sharp kink in the line, a few minutes of alarm bells that I could claim I didn't hear. The world would see it as a merciful end to a tragic stroke. I would be free. The Hale legacy would finally be buried under the dirt, and I could walk away into a morning where she no longer existed. I stared at my hand. It was trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the power I held. For the first time in my life, I was the one with the gavel. I was the one who could decide if the common girl was going to be the last thing Margaret Hale ever saw. I remembered the night I found out I was pregnant. I had been so happy, so naive. I had gone to her with the news, thinking, stupidly, that a grandchild would soften her. She had looked at me over the rim of her teacup with a cold, reptilian detachment. "A child?" she had said. "How inconvenient! I suppose you think this secures your place in our accounts. But remember, dear, a Hale is born of blood, not just circumstances." When the baby was gone, and I was bleeding out in a hospital bed not unlike this one, she hadn't come to see me. She had sent a floral arrangement of white lilies, the flowers of death, with a card that simply said, "Perhaps it's for the best." I felt the heat of that memory flare up in my chest. My grip on the bed rail tightened until the metal bit into my palm. I could end it. I could take back every second of peace she stole from me. But then I looked at her face. Without her pride, without her voice, without her pearls, she was just a heap of failing organs and regret. If I killed her, even by omission, I wouldn't be winning. I would be finishing the job she started 10 years ago. She had spent a decade trying to convince Daniel, the town, and me that I was unstable, that I was cruel, that I was less than. If I let her die out of spite, she would be right. She would win from the grave because she would have successfully turned me into her. "No," I whispered, my voice cracking in the dark. "You don't get that, Margaret. You don't get to take my humanity, too." I reached out, not to the oxygen tube, but to the call button. I pressed it firmly. Within seconds, a nurse appeared at the door. "Her vitals are dropping. Her rhythm is off. Do something." I watched as the medical team rushed in, their voices a flurry of technical terms and urgent commands. I was pushed back into the corner, into the shadows. I watched them pump life back into her. I watched them fight for a woman who had never fought for anyone but herself. I sat back down in my blue plastic chair, my heart finally slowing down. I hadn't stayed because I loved her. I hadn't stayed because I forgave her. I stayed because I refused to let her win the final argument. I chose to be the person she said I could never be, a person of integrity. I leaned my head against the cold wall and closed my eyes. I was exhausted, but for the first time in 10 years, the weight on my chest was gone. I had survived her destruction, and now I had survived her bedbed. The worthless girl was the only thing keeping the great Margaret Hale in this world, and that was a more powerful revenge than any silence could ever be.
On the 10th night, the hospital felt different. The air was charged with a heavy, electric stillness.
the kind of silence that precedes a great collapse. The medical team had stabilized Margaret's heart, but the atmosphere in room 402 had shifted from a battle for life to a quiet vigil for the end. The machines were no longer screaming, they were whispering. I was sitting in the corner, the shadows of the room wrapping around me like a shroud. I was watching her chest rise and fall when I heard it, a sound that wasn't the hiss-click of the ventilator. It was a raspy, wet intake of breath. I stood up, my heart hammering against my ribs. I approached the bed slowly. Margaret's eyes were open. They weren't the unfocused, rolling eyes of a stroke victim anymore. They were clear, they were sharp, and they were fixed directly on me. For the first time in 10 years, we were truly face to face. No lawyers, no Daniel, no social circles to hide behind. Just the victim and the villain in a 10 by 10 room. I leaned in, my face inches from hers. I wanted her to see every line of exhaustion on my face. I wanted her to see the woman I had become in her absence. "I'm here, Margaret," I whispered. Her hand, the one that used to be heavy with diamonds, reached out. Her fingers brushed the sleeve of my sweater, a weak, trembling movement. Her mouth worked, the plastic tube causing her to gag slightly, but she pushed through it. She wanted to speak. The nurses had said it was impossible, but Margaret Hale had always been too stubborn to follow the rules of nature. She beckoned me closer. I hesitated, then lowered my head until my ear was nearly touching her lips. Her voice was a ghostly thread of sound, a rattle of dry leaves against a gravestone. I had to," she wheezed. I pulled back, my eyes narrowing. "You had to what, Margaret? You had to lie? You had to tell Daniel I was unfaithful? You had to tell the town I was crazy?" She closed her eyes for a moment, a single tear cutting a track through the gray skin of her cheek. "You were a threat," she whispered. "He loved you more than the name. He was going to leave me behind. I couldn't lose control. I couldn't let a nobody take the only thing I had left." The honesty of it was like a physical blow. She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't ask for forgiveness. Even now, at the edge of the grave, she was justifying her cruelty. She hadn't destroyed me because I was a bad person. She destroyed me because I was a good one. She destroyed me because my love was stronger than her manipulation, and that was the one thing her money couldn't buy. "You destroyed a human being for a sense of control," I said, my voice trembling with a decade of suppressed rage. "You took my child's father. You took my peace. And for what? Look around you, Margaret. Where is that control now? Where is your son? He's in Singapore closing a deal. He isn't here. Your legacy is a silent room and a woman who has every reason to hate you." She looked at me then, and for the first time the pride was gone. There was only a vast, terrifying emptiness. She realized in that flickering moment of clarity that she had won the war but lost the world. She had kept her son, Hale, but she had lost his soul. She had kept her estate, but she had lost her home. "I won," she breathed, her voice cracking. "You broke me." I looked at her, and suddenly the anger vanished. It was replaced with a cold, sharp clarity. I realized that as long as I hated her, she still had control. As long as I wanted her to suffer, I was still tied to her. "No, Margaret," I said, my voice dropping to a calm, lethal hum. "You didn't break me. You just showed me who I was. You taught me that I could survive the winter. You taught me that I don't need a name to have worth. You destroyed yourself. You spent your life building a fortress, and now you're dying behind the walls, alone. I'm the one who survived. I'm the one who gets to walk out of this room. You never will." She tried to speak again, but the effort was too much. Her eyes rolled back, her breath becoming a jagged, rhythmic gasp. The monitors began to wail, a high, frantic alarm that signaled the beginning of the end. I didn't call the nurse this time. I sat back down in my chair. I watched her. I watched the woman who destroyed my life realize that, in fact, she had only destroyed her own. The confession wasn't an apology, it was an admission of defeat, and as the machines screamed in the background, I finally felt the weight of the last 10 years lift off my shoulders. I was no longer the victim. I was the survivor.
The 10th night didn't end with a bang. It ended with a sigh. By 5 a.m., the hospital was at its quietest. The world outside the window was that strange, bruised shade of indigo that exists just before the sun commits to the sky. Inside the room, the alarms had been silenced. The medical team had done what they could, and now the comfort care protocol had taken over. The aggressive hiss-click of the ventilator had been replaced by a smaller, quieter oxygen mask. The jagged lines on the monitor were now soft, shallow waves, like a tide retreating from a shore it would never touch again. I sat in the blue plastic chair, my hands folded in my lap. I was no longer angry. I was no longer waiting for an apology that would never be enough. I was just there. I watched Margaret's chest. It moved so little now that I had to focus on the edge of the white thermal blanket to see the motion. Every breath was a victory. Every exhale was a surrender. I thought about the thousands of hours I had spent rehearsing my final words to her. I had imagined a grand speech about justice, about the baby I lost, about the cold nights in my car. But as the end approached, I realized that words were just more weight, and I wanted to be light. "It's okay, Margaret," I whispered. My voice was the only sound in the room, softer than the hum of the air conditioner. "You can go. The house is quiet. The legacy is safe. There's no one left to fight." I didn't know if she could hear me, but as I spoke, the tension in her forehead seemed to smooth out. The fragile monster was finally letting go of the world she had tried so hard to cage. I reached out and did something I thought I would never do. I took her hand. Her skin was cold, like river stone, but I didn't pull away. I held it, not as a daughter-in-law, not as a friend, but as one human being witnessing the departure of another. The sound was steady, constant. The waves on the screen flattened into a horizon of green light. Margaret Hale was gone. I sat there for a long time, still holding her hand. I waited for the surge of joy, the I won feeling I had expected, but it didn't come. Instead, there was just a profound, echoing silence. The woman who had been the sun in my dark universe, the gravity that kept me grounded in my own pain, was extinguished. And in that darkness, I realized I was finally, truly alone. And for the first time in 10 years, alone felt like freedom. I stood up and gently placed her hand back on the sheet. I smoothed the blanket one last time. I was turning to leave when the door opened. It was Daniel.
He looked exactly like the man Margaret had raised. His suit was worth more than my first apartment, his hair was perfectly groomed, and his eyes were as cold as a winter morning in Singapore. He stopped at the foot of the bed, looking at the silent monitor, then at his mother, and finally at me. There was no recognition at first, then I saw the moment the past hit him. His eyes widened, a flicker of the man who used to bring me wildflowers appearing for a fraction of a second before the Hale mask slammed back into place. "Elena?" he whispered. "She's gone, Daniel," I said. My voice was steady, devoid of the tremors that used to plague me whenever he spoke. She waited as long as she could, but even Margaret Hale couldn't negotiate with time. He looked at the bed, then back at me, his mouth opening as if to offer an explanation, a justification, or perhaps a belated apology for the 10 years of silence. He looked at my tired face, my cheap clothes, and the way I stood, not as a victim, but as the master of the room. I didn't think you'd be here," he stammered. After everything I wasn't here for you, Daniel," I interrupted. I picked up my coat and my bag. I walked past him, my shoulder brushing his, and I didn't feel a single spark. No love, no hate, just the indifference of a survivor looking at a ghost. I walked out of room 402 and down the long, sterile hallway. I didn't look back. I walked through the sliding glass doors and out into the morning air. The sun was finally over the horizon, a brilliant, blinding gold that washed over the pavement. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and new beginnings. I stood in the parking lot and took a deep, lung-filling breath. It didn't taste like bleach. It didn't taste like grief. It tasted like the rest of my life. I got in my car, started the engine, and drove away. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't need to. The woman who destroyed my life was gone, and the woman who survived her was finally going home.
And so, the story of Margaret Hale ends in a silent room. But the story of the woman who stayed, that story is just beginning. If you are listening to this right now, and you are carrying a weight that isn't yours to bear, if you are living in the shadow of someone who tried to tell you that you are nothing, I want you to listen to me very carefully. Revenge isn't about the other person's suffering. Revenge isn't about seeing them lose. Real revenge is the moment you realize they no longer have the power to make you feel small. Real revenge is living a life so full, so honest, and so beautiful that their memory becomes nothing more than a footnote in your masterpiece. I stayed in that room not to be a martyr, but to reclaim my soul. And today, as I share this with you, I am handing a piece of that strength to you. Before you leave this video, I want you to do something for me. I want you to tell me where you are listening from. Type your country or your state in the comments. I want to see the map of our community growing. Leave a comment with one word, survivor. Let it be a seal on your own journey. Let it be a promise to yourself that no matter who tries to break you, you will be the one who remains. If this story moved you, if it gave you a moment of peace or a spark of courage,
Hit the like button and subscribe. We tell these stories because we refuse to let the darkness have the final word. Thank you for walking these 12 chapters with me. My name is the woman who survived, and I will see you in the next story, because here we don't just survive betrayal, we rise from it. Keep rising.